Hello. The topic of this lecture is determinism and indeterminism. In order to get a handle on the very complex and long-standing philosophical debates surrounding things like determinism and free will and the like, it's necessary first to come to grips with the concept of determinism and its negation, the concept of indeterminism. So first, some definitions. Determinism is the view that all events are caused. That is, for everything that has ever happened, there is some reason why it happened the way that it did and not some other way. Right? And if all such events bear that description, then determinism is the case. If not all events are caused, then indeterminism is the case. So the definition of indeterminism is the view that not all events are caused. So look carefully at these two definitions. You'll notice that they are mutually exclusive and that they completely constrain all possibilities, right? So the idea is that either every event is caused, that is, there's some reason why it happened the way it did and not some other way, or not every event is caused. So one of these two things has to be true, and they can't both be true. So one thing I want to mention is that the textbook kind of makes it look like lots of people argue about whether determinism is true or whether indeterminism is true. And I think that's a little bit of a mischaracterization of what the main areas of dispute really are. And so I'd kind of like to lay that out here. So there are some things that philosophers don't generally argue about with respect to free will and determinism and indeterminism and all that stuff. And then there are some things that philosophers do tend to actually argue about and argue quite extensively about. That is, those are some of the problems that philosophical methods might make progress on. So among the things that people don't generally argue about, the first of them is the definitions of determinism and indeterminism. Those are not particularly contentious. Right? I think just about everybody agrees on what determinism and indeterminism actually mean. And again, with very few exceptions, people don't generally argue about whether determinism or indeterminism is actually true. Now, I'll try and explain why on the next couple of slides here, but before that, I'd like to move over to the kinds of things that philosophers do actually tend to argue about and what the main areas of dispute are among the people who are quoted in your text. The main area of argument is what the truth of either determinism or indeterminism would mean for some other important concepts. Concepts like free will, like morality, or like our understanding of the natural world. There's been some curiosity as to whether free will is compatible with determinism. That is, if determinism were true, then could we actually have free will? And part of that, a big part of that, depends on what free will means, what it is. That's something we argue a lot about, is what the definition of free will is, not so much about the definition of what determinism is. And so morality, you know, if everything happens for some reason, what does that do to our ideas of moral responsibility? Does it leave them more or less intact? Does it require us to modify them, or does it require us to throw them out? And again, a lot of that depends on what you mean by morality and all these other concepts of moral responsibility, not so much what you mean by determinism or indeterminism. There's just as much a question as to whether free will is compatible with indeterminism as whether free will is compatible with determinism. Although that question is given much less treatment in the text, it's just as big of a question. And of course, our understanding of the natural world is these days primarily scientific. And there's a question as to whether a scientific worldview requires us to assume a deterministic worldview, or whether it requires us to assume an indeterministic worldview. And again, a lot of that depends on just what our understanding of the natural world is, just what science is or does or says. So those are the kinds of things that people do tend to argue about, and that's to be contrasted with the argument about whether determinism or indeterminism is in fact the case, or what those things mean. So the reason why we don't tend to argue very much about whether determinism is true or isn't is because of the kind of evidence we would need to make one claim or the other. And so I'm going to give you just a couple of examples here. So imagine that one time, halfway across the universe, 4 billion years ago, some subatomic particle somewhere did something without being caused to do it. If that ever happened, then indeterminism is true. Then it is true that not all events have been caused. If no such thing ever happened, then determinism is true. Now notice the kind of evidence we would have to definitively say that either determinism or indeterminism were true. Since we would have no access to this event that happened halfway across the universe 4 billion years ago, for example, we would just have no reason to say definitively that indeterminism were true. In order to say that determinism is true, we would have to rule out all such events, like that one 4 billion years ago, halfway across the universe on one little subatomic particle. Well, we can't rule it. We can't rule that out, and so since we can't rule it out, we have no reason to say definitively that determinism is true either. And so, essentially, because in order to say whether determinism or indeterminism were true, we would have to say something about all events. We would have to say either A, all events are determined, right? They've all been caused, or we'd have to find some particular cause that we could say definitively was not caused, right? And that's a pretty tall order here. And here's part of the reason for that. So again, this whether all events are caused or not seems like the kind of issue that science ought to be able to settle, but of course it can't. And I wanted to describe why that's the case, why I would say such a thing. So again, in order to establish that determinism were true, if we were going to do that, then scientists would need access to all events, okay? And we just don't have that. That's a problem, and that's an insolvable problem, right? Many events predate our ability to observe anything, right? I mean, the universe was here for billions of years before we were, so that's it. We gotta mail that in. But in order to establish that indeterminism were true, scientists would need to establish that some event was not caused. But it would never be more reasonable to say event X was uncaused than we don't yet understand event X, right? So, I mean, picture any particular scientific study or experiment or anything like that where something happens that people aren't quite sure why it happened. Again, what's more reasonable? You say, oh, well, something happened that we can't account for. Maybe our equipment malfunctioned slightly, briefly. Maybe something happened that we just don't really know how to explain. Maybe we goofed up in a very subtle way that caused something we didn't expect. I mean, like, again, or, oh no, we found some uncaused event that, sort of, somewhere floating around. We just found a thing that just happened for no reason whatsoever. It's always going to be more reasonable to say we don't yet understand some particular event, especially for a scientist, than to say, oh no, it just simply wasn't caused, right? Let's throw out our notion of determinism. So that's part of the problem, right? Is that even our best standards of evidence aren't going to weigh on that issue, on the whether determinism or indeterminism is the case. And while we're at it, let's talk a little bit about science and some of its central assumptions. This comes into play sort of late in the chapter in section 4.6 about neuroscience, where I think our author gets a little bit carried away with what the sciences really can or can't affirm. So science is a philosophy, right? Science is a particular set of assumptions and a particular set of methods that have been undertaken to examine a particular field of topics. It's a wide-ranging field of topics. It's been, sort of very successful, but this idea of what science is essentially grew out of philosophy. It is a philosophy. And as such, it contains some central assumptions, right? There's some things you just have to assume in order to do science. One of those assumptions is realism. That is, you have to assume that the universe exists independently of human minds and perspectives, that there is an out there, right? That we're not just all making it up, right? If you think that the world is or as they say in the children's song, life is but a dream, or something like that. If you think that we're all in some sense making it up and we're in some sort of collective delusion, well, you can't really do science on that basis if that's what you're assuming. You have to assume something like realism, this idea that there's a universe and it exists outside of your head, and it does what it does regardless of what you want it to do or not. Right? That's one central scientific assumption. A second central scientific assumption is what's known as empiricism. That is, the view that all of our ideas come ultimately from experience. That is, if something cannot be experienced, or as scientists would put it, observed, right, it cannot be coherently thought about or discussed. And so science puts out of its bounds anything that is in principle not observable. Right? And so that's part of the, again, scientific worldview. You can't really do science if you're assuming the existence of things that cannot be observed, either directly or indirectly. And finally, determinism. The practice of science, again, as most have it, takes on the assumption that all events are caused, that there's a reason for everything, that there are rules, that those rules are understandable and discoverable. Right? That's part and parcel to the modern scientific worldview. Maybe it's wrong, right? It's possible determinism is not true. But empiricism and realism might also be mistaken too. But if they are, science cannot show that they are because it assumes them to start with. Science cannot also show that realism, empiricism, and determinism are true because it starts off what it does by assuming them. So there's some essential limitations to just what science can do on this kind of a question. And so we're essentially left with philosophy. We need philosophical methods to deal with some of these kinds of questions because they're ultimately questions about concepts and how those concepts interrelate with each other.